Whoa. Hello. I hope everyone can hear me. Well, that no one can hear me yet. I haven't let anybody in. Aha. All right. Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me. My computer didn't do the usual audio check. Okay, good. Excellent. Thank you, guys. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, so we've got a couple more minutes. So we'll just wait, as usual, to see who shows up and who does not. In the meantime, we'll do the old screen share. And let's get the slideshow ready. Closing some applications. I can't. I just need a better computer. All right. Yeah, 7:34 according to my phone. But let's wait a couple of minutes, just for those who may be arriving a little bit late. This is better up here, maybe. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Well, I suppose we ought to get started. Getting this over with. Not that we should look at class as something to get over with, but getting this over with means we're all one step closer to the weekend. And that means that I can continue on with grading all of your stuff and getting caught up with that. So let's just get started, shall we? Let's make myself smaller here. All right, so today we're going to just continue talking about Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is all about the attitudinal theory of emotions, as you will recall. And the attitudinal theory has it that an emotion is an attitude toward an object, an attitude which it is appropriate to have when the latter exemplifies a given evaluative property. Now, this is an embodied theory. Perceptual theories, you'll recall, or at least more modern versions of them, like Prince's, are also embodied. But this, rather than being about judgments, embodied judgments like Prince's theory, or about perceptions of changes in the body on the James Lange theory, here attitudes are understood as felt bodily attitudes. They're sort of like action tendencies or action programs, right? That we feel that are directed toward objects. And objects, as I mentioned last time, does not just mean, an object like this can of sparkling water that I'm holding, but the particular objects, what the authors are calling particular objects. And these can be, people, scenarios, events, these kinds of things. Now, emotions are not about evaluative properties on this theory. Like with the evaluative judgment theory, they are about the objects that bear the relevant evaluative properties. And this also establishes some nice, neat, tidy correctness conditions for emotions, if you'll recall. Our emotions are correct if and only if, that's what IFF means here, are correct if and only if the object really bears that property. So my fear in response to a snarling dog or a venomous spider is correct if and only if those objects are actually dangerous, if they bear the property of being dangerous, which is a value or an evaluative property. So that's what we talked about last time. Another thing we talked about that I'll mention before we get into this next bit is that I, at least for my part, have a bit of trouble, or had a bit of trouble, understanding how this theory is different from, say, embodied theories like Prince's theory, where emotions are embodied judgments, or even how is it all that different from evaluative judgment theory, where emotions are constituted or supposed to be constituted by judgments. How is this different than that? Right? For those who were here last time, I was sort of spinning my wheels a little bit on this one out loud, thinking to myself, like, okay, so a lot of the problems that these other theories seem to suffer from are eliminated if we say that emotions are not judgments or desires, but instead are attitudes, in particular felt bodily attitudes that are felt, correctly or incorrectly toward objects if they, if they have the right properties, if they bear the right evaluative properties. And I was thinking to myself, like, isn't there a judgment in there somewhere? And after rereading this section, I'm thinking to myself, no, perhaps, no, maybe I'm wrong about that. And I'd like to explore some of that with all of you in our discussion today. So before we get back to that, or rather, in order to get back to that, we'll have to talk about some of the virtues of the attitudinal theory as the authors see them. So what are some of these virtues that the authors think their account has? Well, one virtue has to do with the fact that these felt bodily stances, toward objects, are connected to what they call primitive scenarios, where we would experience the emotion, i.e. the felt bodily stance, in the presence of the object that elicits the emotion. We would feel fear in the presence of the saber-toothed tiger or whatever, right? But we need to acknowledge that emotions can also have other cognitive bases besides perceptions, right? And this was a problem that perceptual theories succumbed to. Perceptual theories, according to the authors, seem to wind up saying that emotions are about the body somehow, because they're about these perceptions of changes in the body in response to these objects in the environment, right? But of course, that can't be true. Emotions can have cognitive bases aside from perceptions, as the authors are arguing here. And so these felt bodily stances, although they're kind of grounded in primitive scenarios, in that I suppose you could say that these felt bodily stances evolved because of these primitive scenarios that our ancestors were faced with, we can still have an emotion that's, kind of distant, but still appropriate, distant from those kinds of primitive scenarios, but still appropriate, right? And the funny example here, is this example from 82. The disappearance of one's doctoral thesis from one's computer may elicit terror because of what it may apply for one's life prospects, right? Terror in that instance is quite far removed from, something like a primitive scenario, feeling terror in the presence of a predator or a violent conspecific, right? But it's still appropriate, even though it's not about physical harm, but instead harm for your life prospects, right? And I mentioned this because, while I have never had a run-in with some kind of vicious wild animal that inspired terror, I have had scares like this, where I have lost or nearly lost work that's taken me a very long time to do, and which would, if it were not recoverable, which would obviously have caused harm to my life prospects, particularly my career prospects, right? So this is kind of where these felt bodily stances are grounded. I take the authors as saying that they're grounded in our sort of evolutionary history, our evolutionary psychology, if you will. Although I don't know how the authors would feel about being associated with evolutionary psychology. I'm saying the evolution of the human mind, and not really the discipline of evolutionary psychology, which is, from time to time has proven a little controversial. So we have primitive scenarios, and perhaps this is how basic emotions are grounded or underwritten in the way that we evolved to deal with these primitive scenarios. But they can get relabeled, redeveloped, made more complicated by sort of social and culturally supported concepts and things like that, right? So to continue, the authors say in continuation, now, whether or not the emotion gets relabeled, from a basic emotion, when we're talking about a primitive scenario versus some kind of complex emotion, if we're talking about something that's maybe more particular to quote unquote civilized society and not like hunter-gatherer society. Now, whether or not an emotion gets relabeled, we face a phenomenon that we discussed in the foregoing back in chapter 2, namely the fact that emotions, through the mediation of complex cognitive states, do get progressively calibrated to various types of situations because they share the relevant evaluative property with the primitive scenario. And for that reason, make an emotional engagement of the kind involved in that scenario appropriate. So even though fear evolved as a sort of response to, proximal harms, the evaluative property of danger may still be there, danger to one's life prospects, perhaps, in the case of one's doctoral thesis disappearing from one's computer hard drive, right? And that makes the fear or the terror in that situation appropriate, because the object of your emotion bears the appropriate evaluative property, right? So that's something interesting to note right at the outset. But this is great because it allows us to specify the correctness conditions of the emotions, right? As I said earlier, our emotions are correct if and only if the object of the emotional episode is a bearer of the relevant evaluative property, right? My fear of the snarling dog is only correct if the dog really is dangerous, you see? And also, this account has the resources to explain lots of different emotion types. And I want to kind of kick the ball over to the class to see if anybody can explain how. A good clue here has to do with a sort of parallel with embodied theories like Prince's. So I'll just kick this over to everyone else. And if nobody answers, then I'll go ahead. Just open up the chat in case anyone wants to type. Ooh, so the parallel has to do, the parallel with embodied theories here is all the different kinds of body states there can be, right? You take a look at this here, the variety of different emotion types. Well, there are a variety of body states that correspond to different emotion types. And those body states, those felt action tendencies or felt responses, or as they are called on the previous slide, felt bodily stances. There's a variety of those. And there's one for each emotion type, just as there is a corresponding evaluative property for each emotion type. So this theory has another virtue. It has the resources that we need to explain and individuate all the different emotion types. It's also quite clear what the direction of fit is on this theory. On this theory, emotions have a mind-to-world direction of fit, just like beliefs or perceptions. Remember, the correctness of your belief or perception depends upon whether it fits with the way the world is. And since perceptions and beliefs are located in the mind, we say that they have a mind-to-world direction of fit. And because emotions, as we've seen time and again, have justification and correctness conditions as well, they also have a mind-to-world direction of fit. Further, a couple of conditions that emotions do not seem to have, and we've seen this before, are satisfaction and fulfillment conditions. These are things that desires have, right? Desires are another type of attitude, along with, the authors argue here, emotions, and along with other cognitive states that are generally agreed to be attitudes like beliefs, right? So desires are attitudes, beliefs are desires, desires are attitudes, beliefs are attitudes, emotions are attitudes. But emotions and beliefs have more in common with one another than each of them do with desires in terms of their direction of fit. Desires, remember, have a world to mind direction of fit, right? And that's why they have satisfaction and fulfillment conditions. If you have a desire, if you desire that P, what you want to do is bring it about, to change the world such that P obtains, right? So emotions have a world to mind direction of fit. The desire is represented in the mind, and you want to change the world so that it accords with your desire. But emotions are not like this. Emotions don't have these satisfaction and fulfillment conditions. They don't have the right direction of fit, that is world to mind. So this is a good reason to think that emotions are not desires. And this is important. It allows us to rule out one kind of attitude that, emotions could be. Could they be desires? No, they could not. One important thing to note, though, is that emotions might still be important in forming specific desires and for motivating us to act in specific ways, right? And again, think of fear. I know I talk a lot about fear in this class, but if you think of, being frightened by something, which consists in this sort of felt bodily stance toward an object as dangerous, well, it's pretty easy to see how, like what follows naturally from that is the formation of a desire to perhaps flee the danger, or perhaps to fight, the fight or flight response. So, and this kind of takes care of a problem that we saw with some of the other theories that thought of desires as constitutive of emotions. Oh, excuse me. It seems that desires all too often are not part of emotions, parts of emotions, but kind of tacked on in some way. This allows us to make sense of that without trying to assimilate desires into emotions, right? So that's another virtue of this theory. And here's what I wanted to get back to related to my sort of numerous tangents from last time, right? The difference, what is the real difference between evaluative judgments themselves and these evaluative attitudes, these felt bodily attitudes, these felt bodily stances toward objects that bear evaluative properties? What's the real difference? I kind of had a little trouble making sense of that last time. We'll get into this now. I'm just going to read this quote here. This is from pages 83 and 84. The idea is that the circumstances, think of the primitive scenarios or more sophisticated elaborations of them, that elicit our emotional responses, that is the aforementioned distinct profiles of felt action readiness, constitute central and privileged conditions around which our mastery of the relevant evaluative concepts is built. These circumstances can have this function because the emotions they elicit are attitudes that are correct or incorrect, depending on whether the relevant evaluative property is exemplified. Now, I'm not sure if any of you paid as close attention to this quote as I did on your reading of this, but I'm wondering if any of you have any thoughts either on this particular passage or on what I was talking about last time, the difference between making an evaluative judgment versus having a felt bodily attitude towards something that may or may not display the relevant property. What is the difference? Have you thought about this at all, anybody? Everybody's so quiet today. Well, let's see. Let's take a close reading. They're drawing a distinction between emotions as felt bodily stances, attitudes, embodied attitudes, and evaluative judgments. Evaluative judgment theory. I've gone and skipped a slide. Whoops. Actually, let's just go ahead and read this next bit, because I think that'll make it a bit more clear. We're drawing a distinction between emotions themselves and evaluative judgments, okay? The present approach, as a result, has a clear advantage over EJT. The latter theory must, as we saw in chapter 5, commit itself to a controversial form of motivational internalism. And I've added this here in the brackets. Motivational internalism is the view that evaluative judgments are essentially motivating, right? So EJT has to commit itself to this form of motivational internalism about evaluative judgments in order to respect the intimate connection between emotion and motivation. The present approach explains the intuitions behind motivational internalism without endorsing it, by emphasizing the fundamental role of emotional responses in shaping the evaluative concepts we deploy in making evaluative judgments. So what is being said here? Well, first, what was the problem with motivation internalism? Does anybody remember? Well, okay, I'll go ahead and say. We can easily think of examples of evaluative judgments that may not be motivating, right? All we have to do is find one, and that would seem to spell trouble for motivation internalism, right? Are all value judgments essentially motivating? Maybe we can just think of one example. That would be cool. I won't hold you guys to too much talking if we can think of one example of an evaluative judgment that is not essentially motivating. Oh, here's one. Okay, Robin's thinking, no worries. Excuse me. So I have kind of one. I might judge that a show or a movie is poorly done, right? I can make that judgment. But is that essentially motivating in the sense that it will cause me to stop watching it? it doesn't seem that has to be the case, right? I might continue watching a terrible television show simply because there's nothing else on, right?
So then, like, if I were to judge that, like, Australia is a dangerous place because there's a bunch of scary animals there, that might not motivate me not to go there because, like,
Yeah.
Australia is still a cool place to go, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Like, and it seems to me that there must be lots of examples like this that one could conceivably come up with that would show the problem with motivational internalism, right? Like evaluative judgments, some might be essentially motivating, but is it the case that they always are all the time? That's a pretty strong commitment. So that's the problem I think the authors have, if my memory serves. So we don't do this with the attitudinal theory. Rather, we explain the intuitions behind this claim. That there might be an intuition that some have that evaluative judgments are essentially motivating. This explains this intuition without motivating it or endorsing it, because what the attitudinal theory is trying to do is just emphasize the fundamental role that emotions play in shaping the evaluative concepts that we actually deploy when we make evaluative judgments, right? So this gets a little clearer as we go, right? This is, I guess, the key here, why emotions are not value judgments. As we have seen, evaluative properties are not what emotions are about. These properties generally do not figure in the content of the emotions. Rather, it is in virtue of being the very attitudes they are that the emotions come to have evaluative conditions of correctness. So emotions are just not about evaluative properties, right? And even if it's an embodied theory, if emotions are not about evaluative properties themselves, then they're not value judgments. Because what emotions are really about are the bearers of evaluative properties. Do I still buy this? I don't know, right? It's cool that now emotions have some nice, clean conditions of correctness. My fear is correct if, the dog or the spider or whatever does really represent danger. Yes, an example. Yeah. Well, as I just said, like if there was a dog snarling at me, and that dog was actually dangerous, well, that dog is the bearer of the evaluative property of danger. So here, the dog is the object or the bearer of the property, and the property is danger.
If the dog wasn't dangerous, though, would it still be a bearer of the property?
No, it wouldn't. If the dog was not actually dangerous, it wouldn't be the bearer of that property, and my fear would therefore be incorrect.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. So the authors discuss this further. I hope they really expound on it a little more, because, I'm just not sure, like, okay, I can, this is kind of still perceptual, and kind of still a little judgmental. I don't know if anyone else shares my intuitions on this, but if you do, I mean, I could be wrong. I really could be wrong, but I don't know. It seems that what the authors are saying, again, is that we represent these objects as bearing these evaluative properties by taking these felt bodily stances toward them. I still do not quite understand how this is not, in some important sense, a judgment. And, I could be wrong, and I could be leading everybody in the class astray here, but I'd really like to know if anybody is as confused as I am about this. If you are, go ahead. Right. I don't know what the difference between this and an embodied judgment is supposed to be. Like, okay, there's problems with theories of perceptual theories, you know, insofar as they make emotions about the body, or the body ends up being the object of emotion, because the content of our emotions is these perceived changes in our body states. I get that. Okay, that's a problem with perceptual theories. But if you're somebody like Prince who's saying that, well, these are judgments, they're just embodied judgments, that's what's actually happening, is these possible body states you can take on, or all of the myriad different felt bodily stances that you can have, according to Diana and Tironi. Those are, for Prince, embodied judgments. Here they're just felt attitudes. I don't, I'm sorry, but I don't follow them on this. I don't think I follow them on this. I don't know. Maybe this will become clear in the next few chapters, but I think what I'm going to do is try and read some reviews of this book and see if this is a problem that anyone else has noticed, or if I'm just completely just not understanding what the key difference is supposed to be. You know, Robin's with me. Yeah, I think, yeah. Yeah, a lot of deja vu whenever we get to the end of a chapter in this class, because I'm always thinking, oh, it'll be clearer next time, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just gonna, just for my own benefit and for the benefit of whoever else is interested, I'm just gonna reread this. Okay. So the basic idea between evaluative judgments and evaluative attitudes, what is the basic difference? Background: the circumstances, i.e. primitive scenarios that elicit our emotional responses, so distinct profiles of felt action readiness, constitute central and privileged conditions around which our mastery of the relevant evaluative concepts is built. These circumstances can have this function because the emotions they elicit are attitudes that are correct or incorrect depending on whether the relevant evaluative property is identified. Okay, I get the correctness conditions, but felt action readiness is what our mastery of the relevant evaluative concepts is built around. And it's those, it's the mastery of those concepts that we would employ in a judgment. On a cognitive theory, maybe, but in an embodied theory, I do not see this as a problem. So, and then they offer problems. Okay, I don't know if I agree with that. I don't know. I'm really going to have to see if there are any instances of disagreement out there in the literature with this, because this just strikes me as kind of funny. Either I do understand it better than I think I do, and it's wrong, or I don't understand it and maybe they're correct. I don't know. I will remain agnostic about this. But what are some other virtues of the theory that the authors discuss? Well, they say that it can make some of the problems with mixed theories and the evaluative judgment theory go away. You know, for example, this theory doesn't make unreasonable cognitive demands. And I guess that's why this isn't a judgment, because judgment is cognitive unless you're an embodied theorist. God, I don't know. But this doesn't make unreasonable cognitive demands on the creatures that have emotions, right? Because we want to say that children and non-human animals can have emotions. And yeah, some judgments can be unconscious, can they not? I mean, that still could be cognitive, or unconscious in the sense that it's not deliberative and that it is something that's felt, almost like an intuition, right? So I don't understand the problem that they have here. I don't know. You know, I'm just going to take a quick look here. I've just one moment, everybody. You know, anyone else, if they share these concerns, feel free to chime in. But I'm just going to, just one sec. I wonder if there are any book reviews. Are emotions a critical review? Is there, okay, is there an, oh, interesting. There's a review here I've just found by Joel Spry that was published in Disputatio in 2014. What does the abstract say? It says, Diana and Tironi's The Emotions is both an excellent introduction to philosophical work on emotions and a novel defense of their own attitudinal theory. Right? That's where we are in the book now, their defense of the attitudinal theory. After summarizing their discussion of the literature, I describe and evaluate their positive view. I challenge their theory on 3 fronts. Their claim that emotions are a form of bodily awareness. That's right where we are now. Their account of what makes an emotion correct and their account of what justifies an emotions. Interesting. I can't review the full text now, but okay, so I'm not the only one. Okay, it's just nice to know that I'm not the only one. Okay, so sorry for my little tangent here. And now my neighbor is texting me. Gosh darn it. Sorry, everyone. Okay. All right, so at least I know I'm not alone here. Let's see, where are we going next? More about the cognitive demands. What do they say? Well, you know, we don't want a theory of emotion to be too cognitively demanding because we want to grant that infants and animals can experience emotions too. And here they say, this is from page 85, to have an emotion, it is enough to exemplify a felt bodily attitude of the right kind. And there are all the reasons in the world to think that animals and infants can do this. Now, the difference, though, comes in the fact that non-human animals and infants, and arguably some adult humans, lack the capacity to develop an understanding that only some situations make the emotional responses appropriate, right? And this allows us a way of talking about irrational emotions as such, instead of on an analogy to perceptual illusions, right? And the example, if you'll recall here, you know, again, has to do with, say, you know, like a phobia. Like imagine if you've got arachnophobia. So you have an irrational fear of spiders, right? Do you really have an irrational fear? Well, on other accounts, like embodied accounts, so-called irrational emotions are made sense of by analogizing with perceptual illusions, right? And remember my poorly drawn Mueller-Lyer illusion right here. I did this with a ruler, right? So these lines, even though they appear to be a different length, are actually the same length. This one appears longer and this one shorter. And even knowing this, you still succumb to the illusion, right? And same with the moon illusion, which some of you went outside and observed for yourselves. So good job on that. Some nice backyard astronomy and cognitive science going on there at the same time. We could account for irrational emotions, quote unquote, in the same way, right? I'm not being irrational if I go, because I see just any old harmless spider on my desk. Perhaps I'm misperceiving it as a harm, in the same way I'm misperceiving 2 lines of the same length to be different in length, right? But the attitudinal theory can actually explicitly say, no, there are irrational emotions. You know, there aren't like misfirings or illusions, but there are actual irrational emotions, and they're irrational because the correctness conditions haven't been met, right? So if I see a spider on my desk and it's a harmless spider, and I jump and scream and say, ah, well, then I'm being irrational on this account, because the spider is not bearing the relevant evaluative property for fear. It's not dangerous. It doesn't represent a harm, right? So, and in the chat, Robin says, I think that I kind of struggle with calling emotions either correct or rational because we all react to things so differently. So how can you generalize emotions in that way? Yeah, I understand. I saw a lot of this in the first round of critical responses, right? And again, the key thing, I think the thing that motivates this intuition is that emotions are subjective. And how can something subjective have a correctness condition or a justification condition? But beliefs are also subjectively held, right? And it's perfectly possible to have a false belief. It comes in the way, I think, we talk about beliefs versus emotions, right? If I say, I believe the earth is flat, then I have a false belief, which is to say I have an incorrect belief, right? But if I'm afraid of a harmless spider, it's weird to say I have a false fear, right? That sounds funny. Let's, in ordinary language, right? Let's do ordinary language philosophy like the authors are doing. We just don't talk that way, right? We don't speak of emotions this way. On the other hand, my fear does not seem to be appropriate. It's incorrect in the sense that I need not fear. I ought not fear this harmless spider. Perhaps this is why the author of that review also takes issue with the justification and correctness conditions that Diana and Tironi lay out here. So I don't know. Anyway, Robin's got some more stuff in the chat, so I'll address this now. Oh, little Albert. Yeah. Oh, John Watson and little Albert. Oh, okay, so who knows about little Albert? Besides Robin, of course. Just let me know in the chat. Keep getting messages from my neighbor. I'm sorry. Like, oh, for goodness sake. I live in such a crazy building. Okay, so Becca knows. No one else says, so I'll go ahead and give a little description. So John Watson, the founder of behaviorism, did some behaviorist experiments with little Albert, an infant, and he was able to condition Albert to fear rabbits, which are harmless. I'd say mostly harmless. I guess you could get bitten by a rabid rabbit, and that wouldn't be harmless. But this is conditioning, and remember, on behaviorism, all learning is the product of conditioning. That's a core tenet of behaviorism, because the behaviorists didn't believe that they could directly study the mental. The mind is kind of treated like a black box on behaviorism. We can't directly observe cognition, so we study behavior, right? It's a way of operationalizing the study of the mind. So all learning to the behaviorist is conditioning, which is an association between a stimulus and a response, right? In this case, the stimulus is the rabbit, and the response is Albert's fright or fear of the rabbit. And I believe this was done, I mean, you could never do this experiment nowadays, but this was done by, presenting the rabbit and making really loud noises and making Albert cry. You'd never get this through ethics, right? But yeah, if we think of a case like this, we could perhaps define it as an irrational fear, right? Because the rabbit doesn't represent a danger. But I think, as you correctly point out here, Robin, is it really irrational, given that, yeah, this would be kind of traumatic to an infant, right? So in this case of the, like something like little Albert, it's kind of like, yeah, I'm hesitant to say, by the way, I'm not into this idea of saying that there are irrational emotions, because I do think of emotions as embodied. They're not strictly cognitive. They're also embodied. And yeah, the perceptual illusion analogy just makes perfect sense to me. I'm much more sympathetic to analogizing, the case of fearing a harmless spider with perceiving two lines of the same length as different in length. So that is what I say. And then Robin followed that up with, you could do that too. And I think that, it depends not only on the correctness conditions, but also justification. And even though we could say little Albert's fear of rabbits is not correct, perhaps, it's still justified, we might say, right? Likewise, my fear of a non-venomous snake might still be justified if it looks like a venomous snake because of, evolutionary mimicry or something, right? So it's not just correctness conditions, it's also justification conditions. So I would say, yeah, I mean, I understand what the authors are trying to do here, but I'm a little bit more sympathetic to what the perceptual theory does with this, and that is to draw the analogy between perceptual illusions. So-called irrational emotions aren't really irrational, in the same way that someone who has a false belief is irrational. Because I think emotions are still a little bit more like perceptions here than they are like beliefs, or perhaps even that they are like attitudes. Okay, let's continue. Where are we here? So now we're getting back to these constraints that I've been mentioning. These came up first in chapter 6, I believe. What are the constraints? Well, the authors reiterate them on page 85. There are different kinds of constraints that any theory of emotion has to fulfill, the authors say. They say, remember, first, emotions stand in intentional relations to values without being about values. That's the intentionality constraint. And I think we can already see how their attitudinal theory satisfies this constraint. Emotions stand in relation to values, but they're not about values. They're about the objects that bear those evaluative properties. And that's why there is an intentional relation there. Emotions are about objects that possess the relevant properties and not about the relevant properties themselves. That's the intentionality constraint. Second, emotions are essentially phenomenological states and stand in relation to values in virtue of being the phenomenological states they are. That's the phenomenology constraint. And you can kind of get a sense of this already, right? Emotions are phenomenological states, and they stand in relation to values because the kinds of states they are these felt bodily stances toward objects that bear the appropriate property. Oh, that was a mouthful. And third, emotions are crucial, perhaps ineliminable, sources of justification for our evaluative judgments, even though they essentially depend on other cognitive states providing them with their object. So emotions don't just have perceptions as their cognitive bases, and they are not judgments in themselves, but sources of justification for evaluative judgments, perhaps. I don't know, that's a little bit funny. Can we really claim that emotions are felt bodily attitudes toward bearers of particular properties, and then the judgment follows from that somehow? Isn't that just a post hoc rationalization? Couldn't just the emotion be the judgment? Here I am getting skeptical again. I don't know. Does anyone else know what I mean? emotions can be a source or a justification for a value judgment, but are they really? If I feel afraid, and I run away, and then I think to myself, oh, I was really frightened back there. That thing must have been really dangerous. Is that the judgment when I say that after the fact? Or have I already made the judgment by running away from the dangerous thing? I don't know. What do you guys think? Go to the chat here.
I feel like if you didn't judge it as being dangerous, then you wouldn't run away.
Yeah, like because I'm taking a stance toward an object that bears the property. If that's not some kind of perceptual judgment or just a perception, then I don't know what it is. I'm gonna have to read. I am so gonna read reviews of this book after this, because this is just like, honestly, like, I know this is a tricky book to get through because it's dense and the arguments are very rich. The discussion is very rich. It's a very good book for that. But this is honestly the first time so far where I have gone, oh, I don't know if I understand what's happening here, right? Like I get it up till now, and now I don't know if I get it. Yeah. So anyway, how are we doing for time? 8:25. Good. Well, these are the three constraints, and in the rest of the chapter, the authors talk about the intentionality constraint and how the attitudinal theory fulfills it, and also the phenomenological constraint, how the theory fulfills that. I'm going to leave discussion of the phenomenological constraint for next time, and I'm just going to focus on intentionality. The epistemological constraint is addressed further on in the book, chapters 8, 9, and 10. They come back to this. So just saying. So we'll just talk about how it fulfills the intentionality constraint. So remember, the intentionality constraint is that emotions must stand in intentional relations to values without being about values. And, quote, as we have already stressed, the claim is that emotions are attitudes that are about the actual or potential bearers of evaluative properties, objects that we are aware of via other mental states, what we have called the cognitive bases of emotions. So they're not about the properties themselves, they're about the bearers of the properties, right? And that's how they have intentional relations to evaluative properties without actually being about evaluative properties, right? And this is where perceptual theories kind of get into trouble, right? Because on perceptual theories, many perceptual theories hold that emotions are actually direct perceptions of values. And how could that work, right? Because perceptual theories always seem to end up being about changes in the body. And how are those changes related to values? It couldn't be direct perceptions of values, but indirect in that case. But still, there's some kind of mysterious relation there that the authors think that perceptual theories do a bad job of accounting for. And furthermore, and maybe this is helpful for distinguishing emotions from embodied judgments, the authors say on the same page, we dismissed the manner in which James's model captures the intentionality of emotions because, as you will recall, the body ends up being the intentional object of emotions. Oh, that's what I just said. Great. The problem does not go away even if, as Prince argues, we could be in indirect contact with the evaluative properties by being directly aware of bodily changes. For what lies at the root of this problem is the fact that there is intuitively no sense in which emotions are necessarily about the body. I don't know. I mean, is that a straw man? It might be. I don't think Prince is saying that emotions are about the body, the body states and changes in body states represent the value, the judgment. It is the judgment. So, yeah, emotions about the body. Is that a straw man? I don't know. I really don't know. Well, as I said last time, all of us, including me, are here to learn. And right now I'm learning that I don't understand one of these theories, perceptual or the attitudinal, as well as I think I do. So that is what I've learned today and yesterday, or the previous lecture. Yes, I'm like, so I mean, because I was a student not that long ago. So yeah, don't worry if you are also confused by this. I would say if any of you have the time over the weekend, do think about perhaps reading through some reviews of this book, because I don't know, like I'm getting bells going off where in my head where I'm thinking, oh, this is a good book. Like it really is good. It's well argued. I just don't know if I buy their theory. I don't know. The jury is still out. I mean, I can see how yes, Robin, I can. If I find some, I will post them on Discord. The one that I found is oh yeah, you're welcome. The one that I found just with a quick Google search is on ResearchGate, which also this is a helpful resource for all of you, by the way. ResearchGate is like Facebook for professors and their research, right? You have a profile, you can upload your papers, you can say what you're working on, you can communicate with other people, you can request copies of people's work. I may have to do that to read this review, and I can do that, and hopefully the author will let me read it. And then I can share it on LinkedIn, or not on Discord. But what you can all do is also sign up with a ResearchGate account, especially if you're thinking of having a career as an academic or as some other kind of researcher. Maybe if you're working in private industry or for the government, you can also have a ResearchGate profile and share your research. It's Facebook or LinkedIn for researchers. So this could be helpful when it comes to writing and researching your paper, not just looking for book reviews. Because instead of searching through lots of journals, you can find an author whose work you're interested in and just go right to their page. And if they've got their full texts available, you can just grab them or request them, and you've got all this research right there at your fingertips. So I would recommend everybody go and sign up for ResearchGate. It's really good. It's a nice resource for researchers, either aspiring or professional, right? So now next time, okay, we will discuss how the authors view the attitudinal theory as fulfilling the phenomenology constraint. And then we'll begin the next chapter, emotions and their justification. All right. So yeah, not that long of a class today. I probably could have worked in the bit about phenomenology, but I think what kind of got me hung up was just my continuous confusion over some of the things that I say, or the things that they say about the attitudinal theory and why it's superior to perceptual theories or evaluative judgment theory. Anyway, maybe I'll have more to say about that next time. So are there any questions about anything else? Anything about the material, about the essays, anything at all? Oh, that's not what I wanted. Robin's good. All right, that's good. Anybody else? All good. I think everyone wants to get going to Friday / the weekend. Yes. This is an example of a value judgment that is essentially motivating. The weekend is a good time to chill right? So we want to get there faster, get other stuff done and over with. That seems to be, oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh, fair enough, Isabella. Yeah. And fair enough. Like I have said, you can read the readings before or after my lectures. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Well, since we're kind of riffing a lot more, yeah, I've read it twice, and I'm still like, I'm not seeing the difference between embodied judgments and attitudes, felt bodily stances. Not seeing the difference here. So, yeah. Anyway, yeah, y'all reread it, and maybe I'll even reread it. But we're like really riffing now in these later classes, so I'm almost treating them, because the attendance is so small and a lot of the students are just watching the lectures later on YouTube. It's almost like a little seminar. So I feel like, we'll just keep doing this and getting as far as we can. Yeah. Well, that's great. Yeah, I like doing it this way too. I'd rather do it that way than just talk at you for an hour and a half, right? So, we'll just keep on proceeding, and maybe we'll understand it at some point. Maybe we won't. But it's about 8:34, and I think we should. Just in time for the end, Chelsea.
Hi, I'm so sorry.
We're just wrapping up.
I had a volunteer thing. I'm so sorry. I figured I'd show up and see what was going on. All right.
Yeah, we're just wrapping up, but mostly we're all, including me especially, still confused about the difference between felt bodily stances, i.e. attitudes, and embodied judgments. I had all this here like, oh, this is the difference. And as I'm reading it out loud,
It fell out. It fell out. That's fine. I tried to explain it the other day to somebody, and he was like, wait, I don't get it. And I was like, I know. Neither do we. We're studying it.
And just so that you don't have to rewatch the whole lecture to get to this, I did recommend to everybody sign up for ResearchGate for your writing your paper to look for resources.
Sure. Okay.
And look for book reviews of this book.
Ooh.
Because I just Googled them when I was talking now during the lecture. I Googled it and I was like, okay, so here's a book review that takes issue with kind of some of the stuff that I seem to be having a problem with. So I might not be alone in my confusion. Anyway, awesome. Yeah, okay. But that's it. You haven't missed much. Everything else, and everyone else is going to reread it, rewatch this lecture. Everybody try to maybe understand it if you can. But if you don't, no worries, because I might not either.
Okay, cool. Thanks for letting me in.
Yeah, no problem. But that's it, everybody. So if there are no other questions, then we'll wrap it up, and I'll get the lecture online for everyone else. So
thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. All right. End transmission.